Hello, and welcome to our Syxsense Patch Tuesday, July webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday release. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after. And with that, Rob Brown.
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everybody to this month's Patch Tuesday webcast. We actually have a really a lot to talk about. A few very serious vulnerabilities. So I'm going to get straight into the news. Some things that we're going to be showing you today isn't just how serious some of these vulnerabilities are, but actually how over the last 20 years we've been developing the selection process to help our customers deploy over 200 million patches over that time. To start with, we're going to talk about Windows 10 Home and Pro 21H2. That is the feature update for Windows 10 that is now end of life. The last patches you will have received for that would have been last month. So if you're still on Windows 10 Home and Pro 21H2, you will need to upgrade it urgently. Windows 10 Enterprise 21H2, on the other hand, will go end of life on the 11th of June of next year. And that might sound like a lot of time, but really it's not. You really do need to start planning now to get the next version of 22H2 deployed as quickly and as urgently as possible if your feature update has already expired. Now, if you get to 22H2, that will be the last and final feature update for Windows 10, which will eventually retire on the 14th of October 2025. Microsoft are recommending that you deploy Windows 11, which has a similar feature update style. So you'll have 30 months to keep your feature update up to date. And I thought this was interesting. Later this year, on the 1st of October, Microsoft are going to be rebranding Azure AD. So we've known Azure AD since the beginning, and I think everyone is still going to continue to call it Azure AD, but on the 1st of October, they're going to rebrand it as Microsoft Entra ID. Now, they're saying that there's not going to be any changes to the capabilities, to the APIs, login URLs, PowerShell, etc. But you might be surprised on that day if you do have any sort of shared internet favorites that suddenly it looks different. And of course, if there are any updates for Azure AD, obviously it will be renamed to Microsoft Entra ID. Now, the first most important thing to talk about today is actually not patches. So Microsoft threw us a curveball yesterday. They released a CVE 2023-36884, and they released it as detection guidance. This is we believe this is a state-sponsored attack. Microsoft has detected that the Microsoft Office and Windows HTML is being used in a remote code execution vulnerability in a targeted attack. And they haven't actually released a patch for it, but we're going to talk about that in just a second. The reason we need to talk about it is because of the impact. It just has a severity of important, but a CVSS score of 8.3, and anything more than 9 is classified as critical. It is, however, weaponized. So Microsoft and their antivirus partners have detected that this is being used in those attacks. And not only that, but it's public aware as well. So the precise method to expose it has been published on the internet, and it has a jump point, meaning that you can jump from one technology to another. So let's go take a look at that. That's actually on the Microsoft site. We'll just come across and bring this to run through all of the details. Now, this particular vulnerability, as I mentioned, is important in severity, but it can be exploited over any network. And any network means that it could be the internet, it could be the local WAN, LAN, or local to the device. It does, however, have high attack complexity. That's probably why the CVSS isn't as high as I would assume it to be. It does, however, need user interaction. And as I mentioned, the jump point, or what is called the scope, that is changed. That means that this particular, if exploited, the resources beyond this scope can be used to manage other areas of the operating system. Basically, if this vulnerability was for Hyper-V and it was a vulnerability for the host, you potentially can jump to the guest or vice versa. Hence why this is extremely serious. Now, Microsoft have said that they're investigating these reports, and we have heard that these potentially could be state-sponsored attacks. They're aware of this particular vulnerability where those that are exploiting are using specially crafted Microsoft Office documents. It does require your users to open a document, and if you've educated your staff not to click something they're not expecting, you might say that you're safe from this particular vulnerability, but sometimes mistakes can happen. Now, what Microsoft have provided is a registry key down here, where if you set this registry key with a data value of 1 against with each of these executable files within the registry key area, you're able to mitigate this vulnerability from impacting your environment. Now, of course, there is no patch, and we're expecting a patch to be released, but it hasn't. So for now, you will need to ensure that you deploy this registry key across all of your devices to stop any sort of attack on your device. Now, if you're a Syxsense customer, put this CVE number into your console inside the security section here, and we've already created a post-patch scan for you to use to scan your devices to identify which devices are potentially exploitable. And if you're a Syxsense enterprise customer, we have actually created a remediation script for this as well. So you'll be able to scan for the vulnerability, and you'll be able to deploy that registry key to mitigate the vulnerability. As always recommended, please keep an eye on the Microsoft official guidance. If Microsoft recommends that you remove those registry keys after you've applied that remediation, please do so. With Syxsense, you'll be able to do that. However, if you aren't able to, maybe this is something that you could use a group policy to help you resolve. The second one is guidance with a reference number of 230001. These are signed drivers being used maliciously. Microsoft have also identified through their security partnerships that some drivers have been published to the Windows Hardware Developer Program that have within them an exploit. And if you were to deploy these drivers, the attacker could gain administrative privileges on your device. And again, we're just going to take a peek at this official guidance from Microsoft. Now, they're calling this a post-exploitation activity, and in the attacker gained administrative privileges of those systems to compromise them. Now, they are aware of which accounts were used. There are several accounts that were used. They've identified those accounts and they've suspended them. And that's very important. Going forward, you won't be able, or you shouldn't be able to have access to these compromised drivers. And just for reference, Microsoft is working with their Microsoft Active Protection Program partners called MAP. Syxsense is actually a partner, and they're working to help identify which of those drivers could have been compromised and how to remediate any compromised system. Microsoft is recommending that please ensure your antivirus is up to date. They have provided detection guidance to each of your antivirus organizations, and through those antivirus organizations, they should be able to detect which drivers could have been compromised and to remove any of those compromised drivers. So please be aware, this particular guidance is very serious. Now, CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, we do like to listen to CISA. They often suggest that these are for government agencies. However, if it's important enough for the government agencies, it's important enough for us. Mozilla have released a Firefox and a Firefox ESR fix known as MFSA 2023-26. An attacker that exploited this could take control of the system, and they're recommending that you apply the necessary updates as soon as possible. Now, jumping to Microsoft, probably while you're here, we had a huge release. Actually, this is probably twice as big as what we had previously. 130 fixes, which consisted of 10 critical and 120 important fixes inside those updates. The more updates you have, the larger the payload. So we're probably looking at a 1.5, 1.6 gigabyte cumulative update. It's going to take longer to deploy across your organization. So please, where you can, apply those mitigations to help save your bandwidth and to resolve the issues quicker than deploying a large patch. Syxsense is able to do a peer-to-peer download to save local and LAN-based traffic, so that only one device downloads at a time. However, if you do not have a tool that can help you to deploy in a highly distributed environment, please use the workarounds and mitigations from the official documentation. 3 of the 130 are more likely to be weaponized, 4 are weaponized. To be very clear, the patches that have been released by Microsoft today, 4 of them are weaponized. The first vulnerability I mentioned is also weaponized, but it doesn't have a patch. Therefore, if you're seeing in the news outlets that there are 5 active exploits, it's actually 4. One of them you will require a non-patch to resolve. None are public aware, except that first one we mentioned. And a total of 7 have jump points, and this is very serious. As I mentioned, this is where you can exploit a particular vulnerability, and once exploited, move into another technology on the system. It's actually how the SolarWinds attack occurred. They went through one particular vulnerability, exposed, and then moved sideways, and extremely difficult to track. So we do recommend that any vulnerability that has a jump point is also included in your remediation strategy. Now we have a new winner. So we've been tracking this now for about 4 or 5 months, and it's really interesting to see the numbers of bug fixes that are in the Microsoft release. And usually remote code execution is number 1. It was actually topped this month by elevation of privilege with 34 individual fixes. Elevation of privilege is where a threat actor gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. So it's really, really serious. Remote code execution is the way that cyber attacks occur, where the attackers remotely execute commands on your device to download malware, install something on the device that then compromises it. We have denial of service in 3rd place. That's an attack which is meant to shut down the machine, making it inaccessible. We've seen that a lot, especially from the attacks in Ukraine, where they simply want to cause trouble. They don't necessarily want to create a ransomware scenario. They just want to stop devices and cause as much carnage as possible. Information disclosure That's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information, such as a memory leak or a CPU cycle leak, where you can actually read the data that's happening on the device in real time. We have security feature bypass. That's when an attacker bypasses all of the authentication mechanisms that are supposed to be in place to allow unauthorized access. And a lot of times those types of attack allow you to bypass that feature and to perform functions as the user that's logged on. So if you're an admin on your PC, potentially what can be utilized is under the security of your own account. Extremely serious. And lastly, but not least, spoofing. That's the act of disguising a communication or identity. So we have a new winner this month. We talk about this an awful lot, especially when I'm describing some of the vulnerabilities that you should be prioritizing. Certainly, as is this year, elevation of privilege and remote code execution continue to be the most serious types of bug fixes Microsoft is addressing. So how are we going to prioritize it? This is how we do it at Syxsense. And if you don't have Syxsense solution, don't worry. We're going to explain how you can use what we're going to talk about in any tool set that you might have. We do need to understand that vulnerabilities have a severity, but not all vendors classify their severity of vulnerability the same. And usually that is from critical, high, medium, and low. The NA severity sometimes is used where the vendor doesn't see this as a security vulnerability, more like a bug fix or an enhancement. The CVSS score is an independent score that we've been using since the beginning of Syxsense. Current version of CVSS is 3.1. There is a 3.2 coming. And what it can do is calculate exactly the scenarios that have to occur in order to exploit. So when we talk about attack complexity, when we talk about the authentication, the user interaction requirements, all of that is taken into consideration, and they can publicly release a score from 10, 10 being the worst, 0 being the least, that allows you to see how they are setting the severity for the vulnerability. Now, we put the two together and we have a pretty transparent way of organizing what priorities we have in your environment that you may choose to remediate urgently or less urgently. Then we have the state, because we don't want to just use the severities alone, but we have a state of the vulnerability. So a vulnerability that is weaponized means that it is under active exploit somewhere. It doesn't necessarily mean it's global worldwide, but it has been seen by Microsoft or the Microsoft antivirus partners that particular public aware does not mean it's weaponized. It means that someone, maybe via a bug bounty program, has published data that shows exactly how they can exploit it. And if something has been shown on the internet or via YouTube, how exactly to exploit that vulnerability, you wouldn't want to be an IT manager that said, actually, it was low severity, it wasn't weaponized, it was public aware, so I didn't prioritize it. Public aware is your early warning signal that actually you ought to include those in your patch management strategy. Now we can balance everything with what we call a countermeasure. A countermeasure we've talked about already today. The first one is a mitigation and a workaround. Workarounds, registry keys, services, changes to the operating system that mean you don't have to necessarily deploy the entire patch to fix the vulnerability. And mitigations, potentially one of the vulnerabilities which we have today, which is for Microsoft Server, it's incredibly serious, but only impacts RAS. So if you don't have RAS installed on your server, it is actually less severe than you think, because it only can be exploited if RAS is installed. So those countermeasures are really helpful for you to understand where you have an option instead of rolling out a big update. Now you put everything together and you include your exposure into that, and that will really help you choose the patches that are exposed the most in your environment based on all of the classification. If you're a Syxsense customer, use the vendor severity, the CVSS score, the weaponized, and the public aware flags that are available inside Patch Manager, and that will help you choose the patches that are the most serious in your organization. If you're not a Syxsense customer, don't worry. I'm going to show you just how to do that right now. So what you're going to need to do is pop over to our website, to syxsense.com. On the website, you'll find right at the top a resources section. Under the resources section, we've got our resource center with all of our published articles, including any news or events that we're running. Under the news page, you'll have our Patch Tuesday holding pages. We also do third-party Linux webinars as well, which we recommend that you would like to join if you have those operating systems, because it can help you identify which vulnerabilities are actually being weaponized at the time. Now, if you go to the news page, everything is published the day before Patch Tuesday. So this was actually published yesterday. If you do have any questions, though, when you see these articles, and maybe you're not a Syxsense customer and you would like a strategy, regardless of the tool, it's education for us. Send us a message, use the chat in the corner here, say, hey, could we have patch management deployment strategy best practices, and we'll send you a PDF to help you understand the 5 or 6 steps you need in order to deploy patches safely in your environment. If you'd like to see more about Syxsense, you can schedule a demo using the button in the corner. Now, as we said, we had 130 fixes this month. Not only was it an incredibly large list of vulnerabilities, we had some of the most serious vulnerabilities we've had for actually quite a while. 10 of those are critical. 5 of them have a CVSS score rated over 9, which from a CVSS perspective classifies it as critical. We had fixes for Microsoft Office, components, .NET, Visual Studio, Azure. Of course, we'll be calling it something else in a couple of months. DevOps, Dynamics. We had printer drivers, which is the printer driver nightmare that we had just recently. DNS servers and remote desktop. They all had fixes in this month. Now, what I like to do is analyze this release compared to the previous release, because we've had quite a few Patch Tuesdays where the numbers have been much less, but the vulnerabilities they've addressed are very, very severe. So what I've done this time is I've counted all of the CVSS scores up for all of those 130, and we actually end up at 861.7. So that's actually massively up on last month, which was 500.2. The average CVSS score is 7.2. So even though we had a huge number in addition to last month, we also have a much larger number of more serious vulnerabilities in this release. Now, I've chosen 3 in particular, and I've done some write-ups on them, but we've also listed all of the others as well in priority order. The first one I'd like to talk about is CVE 2023-32049. That's the Windows Smart Screen security feature bypass. So the Smart Screen is to help you secure your environment. Well, this vulnerability was found by the Microsoft Threat Intelligence team. The attacker was able to bypass the open file security warning prompt. So if you launch something, it wouldn't tell you that this particular file was not secure. You could actually be allowed to run something that had been designed specifically to exploit your device, but it wouldn't warn you. This vulnerability is weaponized. Has a vendor severity of important, a CVSS score of 8.8. Now, its risk, well, it can be exploited over any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges whatsoever, but it does require the user to run something. So that might be your only saving grace if your users are educated. Second, CVE 2023-35311. This is a Microsoft Outlook security feature bypass vulnerability. This vulnerability impacts Microsoft Outlook, and the user would have to click on a specially crafted URL or email to compromise the attack. Okay, your users wouldn't open a link in an email, agreed, but the preview pane is an attack vector. So just looking at the email in the preview pane is a risk. That is why this carries a CVSS of 8.8. Its vendor severity is important. It can exploit over any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges, but it does require the user to at least look at the email in the preview pane. Now, my third, which is similar to the first one, is Microsoft Outlook security feature bypass. So this particular vulnerability has the jump point. This particular vulnerability is for Office. So in an email attack scenario, an attacker could exploit the vulnerability by sending the specially crafted file to the user or convincing them simply to access a web page. In a web page-based attack, an attacker could host a website or leverage a compromised website that users go to that contains that specially crafted file. As I mentioned, this one does have a jump point, which is extremely serious, and echoed by the CVSS of 9.6. It's actually one of the highest CVSS rated vulnerabilities in this release, and therefore it does make my top 3. This particular vulnerability has can be exploited over any network, including the internet, low attack complexity, low privileges. It does require the user to look at the email or to open a link. But as I mentioned, it does have a jump point. So from Outlook, you could jump into another technology on the operating system, potentially even into Windows. Incredibly, incredibly serious. Now, what we've done down here on the page and following, we've put the CVE numbers in order of priority according to the CVSS, the vendor, the weaponized, the public aware. Take the CVE numbers from here, pop them into the tool that you have. And if you go down this list, maybe the top 10, shouldn't take you too long. Whichever vulnerabilities have been found the most, start deploying those first. If you can deploy them all together, wonderful. If you can't, break them into individual deployments. Microsoft are calling these rings. I think that's a great idea. Roll those out in a phased way, and then continue through the priorities as you see them. Under the additional sections, additional details section, you'll find all the other notes that we've created, such as how you might bypass this with a mitigation or a workaround, or in fact, how you might not need to deploy this in that example when I mentioned RAS. Thank you very much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please submit them to the chat and I'll privately respond to everybody. And until August, I wish you happy patching.